Today's lecture in the History of Creativity series is called Creativity Begins to Flow. Today we want to discuss the origins of civilization and how creativity was an important part in blending and beginning civilization, blending it into later aspects of civilization. Before civilization, people were hunter-gatherers. That meant that they lived in relatively small family-based units, and they wandered simply chasing herds, wild herds, and they also hunted and dug up roots or picked fruit wherever they could find them. These small units, really just extended families, were relatively isolated and interacted little with others. On the other hand, we have cities, which began the purpose of civilization or the practice of civilization. These cities were a tremendous instrument for progress. We find interactions that occurred in the cities that spurred a lot of progress for humankind. Cities were able to do both local and long-distance trade, whereas these small little family units were just simply trading with an occasional encounter with some other small unit. Maybe they would visit the other unit for marital purposes. Maybe they would visit the other unit to raid and steal. But relatively small interactions. Whereas cities had to interact with other cities in order to get food and in order to sell goods that were produced within the cities. Advancements in the hunter-gatherer side were principally on a personal basis, and rarely were these advancements passed on over multiple generations. Whereas in a city, advancements were for the entire society, and they were almost always retained and added upon. And that last part is why civilization became so powerfully interconnected with cities, because whatever creative events occurred in the city, those events were retained and passed on from generation to generation. And that is the concept behind civilization. Now, perhaps you would like to know why we built, why we created, and why we formed dynamic civilization. Here's a little video that will explain some of those concepts for you.
Believer. Harry, do you realize you just invented the wheel?
I know.
Bronze. Iron.
All was in chaos till Euclid arose and made order.
What is the good life? And how do you lead it?
Who shall rule the state?
The philosopher king.
The aristocrats.
The people.
You mean all the people? What is the nature of the good? What is the nature of justice?
What is happiness?
Hail Caesar! Roman law is now in session.
Allah be praised. I've invented the zero.
What?
Nothing.
What is the shape of the earth? Flat. What happens when you get to the edge? You fall off. Does the earth move? Never.
earth moves.
The earth is round.
The blood circulates. There are worlds smaller than ours.
There are worlds larger than ours.
Hey, what are you doing? I'm painting the ceiling. What are you doing? I'm painting the floor.
Darwin says man is an animal.
Rot. Man is not an animal.
Animal.
Man
Isn't. And he's an animal.
Shall we start from the beginning?
I'm a bug, I'm a germ, I'm a bug, I'm a... Louis Pasteur. I'm not a bug, I'm not a germ, I'm not a bug.
Think it'll work, Alfred?
Well, let's give it a try.
What do you think?
It worked. All men are created.
Life, liberty, and the pursuit.
Workers of the world.
Government of the people, by
The world must be
people,
made
enforced
safe for
The war
democracy.
to end
A league
all
of
war.
nations.
I see 1/3 of a nation ill-housed, ill-fed.
one world.
I've actually taken the main principal concepts behind the formation of civilization and divided it into 4 different major subject headings, each of them with a letter to help us remember, a mnemonic device. This mnemonic is called flow, to indicate the flow of civilization. The F stands for food, food in abundance. If we don't have sufficient food, then a city cannot exist. Therefore, one of the principal reasons that we have civilization is simply we had an agricultural revolution where people discovered how to grow sufficient food for the city. The L in flow stands for labor specialization. That means that when the people moved into cities, they started to choose different kinds of occupations. Some became scientists, some became doctors, some became soldiers, some became rulers, some became bakers or shoemakers. But all of them contributed to the welfare of the entire civilization. The O in flow stands for order and organization of society. We don't really see successful civilizations that are chaotic. There must be some order and organization, usually with a single person, a king, most often at the top, and then king's ministers and other bureaucrats helping to provide some organization. Sometimes there was a church, and the church would also give organization to the society. Finally, the W in flow is for writing systems. And writing became an important part of civilization and, of course, helped preserve our record of what that civilization was. Now let's look at each of these 4 elements, F-L-O-W, in turn. First, food. Food allowed the people to move into populated cities of reasonable size. It gave us the advance of population density, and with greater population, there were more purchases and therefore more goods needed. And with more goods needed, there were more people going into these specialized labor areas. And all of that worked together to improve the general economy. The people who moved in to the cities had some technological advances and developments that assisted them. First of all, of course, there were the agricultural advancements, and simply that meant learning how to domesticate grain. Secondly was the plow, a way of tilling the soil and allowing for the improvement of agriculture. Third was the famous invention of the wheel. And in the case of cities, it provided transportation, It also provided mechanisms for helping to till the ground, and even more than that, it provided a general way to power some machines. And finally, there was materials development. We have often heard the world referred to as the age of stone or the age of iron, and we'll talk about how each of those major ages was a result of this shift into civilization, into cities. First, domestication of grain. It's interesting that there are 56 wild grasses possible for domestication. Now, why would a grass not be possible? Well, it might have a head that is, or a seed that is so small that it's impractical to grind it. Or it might have seeds that are gathered through the growing season, but then before they become fully ripe, they are dispersed by the head. And of course, if you're going to grind them, you've got to keep the seeds in their head all at one time. It may be that the seed is not very nutritious and therefore would not be valuable for making bread and other flour products. And it may be possible that the seed cannot be stored for a long period of time. So it must have at least those criteria in order to be domesticated. And of that 56 possible varieties of seed-bearing plants, there were 32 of them that were native to the Mediterranean Eurasia area, that is the greater Mediterranean area. And there were only 11 in any other single area. Therefore, it's clear that the Mediterranean had the greatest chance for agricultural improvement by domesticating grain. And therefore, that's why we see civilization beginning in the Mediterranean area. Next, let's talk about labor specialization. We're going to look at science, art, business, and how all of those were tied to technology. So technology is to be thought of as the driving force that allows civilization to evolve to ever improved circumstances. So let's look at technology first with respect to science. In a way, science did not become very important for civilization for many, many, many years. Technology didn't depend on science as it does today. In the ancient world, technology was intuitive. It was developed by craftsmen. It was developed by people who had that flash of brilliance, but they didn't really understand the depth of science associated with what they were doing. And therefore, technology and science are rarely linked together in the ancient world. Second, technology and art. The word for technology in ancient Greek is techne, and the word for art in the ancient world is also techne. And therefore, those two words, those two meanings of the word techne, tell us the close association between technology and art. They are, in essence, the same concept. One is art over something aesthetic. Technology is art over something that is practical and useful. Now let's talk about technology in business. Technology helped artisans improve their products, and that was the basis of business excellence. Business in the ancient world was simply an artisan would make something and then try and sell it through some means of distribution, and therefore technology was critical to the success of business. Now let's talk about materials. We've all heard of the Stone Age, and we think of some caveman running around with a stone axe. That may have been the case for a few years in the hunter-gatherer civilization. There were, of course, stone axes. We have found them. There were stone or flint arrows and spears. But that isn't really the important part of the age of the Stone Age. What we really see as critical, and that part that developed in the cities, was the creation of pots, ceramic pots. These things were used for storage. Obviously, they were used to keep water or other wine or other liquids. They were used for solid storage, grains and other things. And we still see on some of the ancient ships that have been recovered from the Mediterranean these large pots that were used for storage. We also see decorative devices, some necklaces and bracelets, and they show the artistic side of the age of pottery. But early in the civilization history, we see a shift from the pottery age, from the Stone Age, if you like, to the age of bronze. Here's a funny little video that will give you some of the interesting insights into that shift into the Bronze Age.
Redbeard, do you think if I finish chipping this flint by a time when sun is hottest, you could get it tied to a stick by a time when we all get hungry?
I don't think so, Big Feet. You're forgetting. Today we've all got to go to clearing where we go sometimes, from time when cricket shut up until time when we go back to our huts.
Really? What for?
It's Bronze Orientation Day.
Oh, bugger. I'm so sick of hearing about bronze. Bronze, 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 bronze. What's wrong with stone? Does stone not work all of a sudden?
Well, they say that bronze will revolutionise the way we hunt together.
Well, maybe, but I can't be doing with it. Horrid, shiny stuff. Ugh.
Guys, this is Hairy Back from Tribe in the Valley who have lots of jewellery all of a sudden. He'll be leading our Bronze Orientation Day. Hairy Back, this is Big Feet and Redbeard, our foremost chipper and tire.
Oh, great. Well, you're exactly the kind of people I need to get through to. And my message for you is this. Don't be afraid of bronze. Really. Unless, of course, someone is attacking you with a bronze axe, in which case you should be afraid, because bronze is brilliant. Meet bronze. Bronze is your friend. Bronze is user-friendly, multi-purpose, exciting, zeitgeisty, and most importantly of all, it's slightly shiny. Every day we're finding new uses for bronze. Bronze plates, bronze cup, bronze hats, bronze shoes, even bronze windows. And bronze doesn't even need to be chipped. So, stone is dead. Prepare for the age of bronze. Thank you. Yes, you have a question.
Yeah. When you say bronze doesn't need to be chipped, right, my question is, doesn't it?
No. With new modern smelting, old-fashioned chipping is a thing of the past.
Right, because I'm a chipper, you see.
Right, well, I won't lie to you. Chippers, as a breed, are going to go the way of the saber-toothed tiger. No, I mean they're going to be extinct. But have you thought about retraining as a smelter?
No, I haven't. I mean, smelting may be fine for the lads, but I'm no smelter. And while bronze may be terribly clever, stone was all my old dad ever needed to feed a family of as many hands as I have and then more than that. I just say, as a tribe, why don't we leave the bronze to the smart Alex and the whiz kids, and we'll just carry on using stone axes like we always do.
Because if you do, the tribes with the bronze axes will kill you, and then take your stone axes, and then throw them away because they're rubbish.
Oh.
Yes?
Will the bronze still need tying to sticks?
Oh, yes.
Cracking.
Bronze is such an interesting material. Look at this chart and see if you could discover bronze. Notice that here we have copper and its hardness at 35, tin and its hardness at 48, and can you imagine that by taking a material with hardness 35 and a material with hardness 48 and combining them and getting a material with hardness of 78? Why, that's absolutely astounding. How could two things combine to give something much, much better? That creative idea, that concept of how you would take copper and tin and put them together to make bronze was one of the truly astounding early points in civilization. But after you've done that, how would you ever find tin? How would you discover where there were tin ores available that could be mined? That's just a marvelous concept of creativity. And where would you find that tin ore and how would you get it extracted from the rocks where it was found. All of those things lead to a great concept of tin and copper being made into bronze. But the Bronze Age did not last as the premier material. We see that the Iron Age came after the Bronze Age, and the Iron Age presented a whole new set of problems. Iron ore is relatively abundant, but here's the problem. Look at our little temperature chart and you will see the difficulty. Tin melts at about 450 degrees, bronze at about 1900, copper only slightly higher at 1980, but iron melts at 2800 degrees. And here's the problem. Most fires cannot reach 2800 degrees. So in addition to the problems of finding the iron and gathering the ore together, when you put it into a furnace and tried to smelt the iron from the rocks, you couldn't get it hot enough. And therefore people had to discover new ways to do that. One of those ways was to develop a bellows that blew oxygen, air of course, through the fire, and that made it burn hotter, but it still wasn't hot enough. And then people realized that if they took wood and they charred the wood, that is, they made charcoal out of the wood, or if you choose, they could take coal and they could burn that impartially and create coke out of the coal. So coke out of coal and charcoal out of wood are incompletely burned materials. But what happens when you incompletely burn it is that the low burning materials are removed and only the hot burning materials are left behind. Therefore, if you take iron ore, mix it with charcoal, and blow air through it, you get a fire that is greater than the melting point of iron, and you can smelt the iron and convert it into useful tools. Iron was much better than bronze because it was tougher. If you hit it, it wouldn't break as easily, and therefore iron was to be greatly desired. Here's a record of iron, or at least the Israelites' lack of iron, from the Bible. Let's read in Judges chapter 4, verse 3, the complaint of the Israelites. And the children of Israel cried unto the Lord, for he, that is Jabin, king of Canaan, had 900 chariots of iron, and 20 years he mightily oppressed the children of Israel. Why did he oppress them? Because the Canaanites had the technology of iron and the Israelites did not. There are other places where it clearly indicates that the Israelites were under the subjugation of the Canaanites and of the Philistines for long periods of time because the Canaanites didn't have iron. Eventually they got it. Eventually the entire world got it. Now let's talk about order and organization. In early society, these kings who assumed power were sometimes quite enlightened, and they would establish a set of laws that were binding on their society. One of the earliest of these enlightened kings was a man in Babylon whose name was Hammurabi. About the year 1700 BC, that's really quite early, several hundred years before Moses, Hammurabi developed a code called the Hammurabi Code. And it is simply a code of laws that helps him administer and give continuity and consistency to the people in Babylon. It was found in Mesopotamia, that is the area around present-day Iraq, and it was carved on an 8-foot stone pillar called a stela. At the top was a picture of Hammurabi and a minister, and below Hammurabi's picture is this code. Let's just take a look at one of the concepts from that code, and you can get an idea of what the Hammurabi Code was all about. Here we see a concept called trial by ordeal. What that simply means is that a person who accuses another would have to go through some kind of an ordeal. Let's read and we can see what that is like. If a man has accused another of laying a death spell on him, but has not proved it, the accused shall go to the sacred river. He shall plunge in the sacred river. And if the sacred river shall conquer him, he that accused him shall take possession of his house. If the sacred river shall show his innocence, and he is saved, his accuser shall be put to death. He that plunged in the sacred river shall appropriate the house of him that accused him. This is kind of what we think of today as eye for eye. If you accuse someone and you are found to be at blame, even though you accuse the other person, then he can take from you what you would have taken from him. Let's compare the Hammurabi Code with the Code of Moses as found in the Bible. In the first case, in the case of Hammurabi, these were existing laws that King Hammurabi just simply gathered together. He made no pretense, he made no assertion that these laws came from anything except the traditional society. On the other hand, Moses received his laws from God, and therefore they had a divine character to them. In the case of the Hammurabi Code, then, there was little religion. In the case of the Mosaic Law from the Bible, it was a religious code. We can also compare these two codes by looking at, for instance, those things, those crimes that were considered to be punishable by death. In the case of the Hammurabi Code, false accusation or witness, stolen temple goods, interesting, a stolen child, that would be kidnapping, assisted fleeing of a slave, or adultery. In the case of the Mosaic Law, murder, smiting or cursing parents, stealing a man and selling him, that is, creating a person into a slave, killing a fetus, and adultery were capital crimes. We can also see the balance of justice between both codes, and it was an eye for eye compensation. That is, if you are wronged, then the person who wrongs you must suffer what you have already suffered. And sometimes that's a payment, and that was accepted. There is a major difference between the Hammurabi Code and the Code of Moses. In the Hammurabi Code, there is a change in the punishment and a change in the standard to which a person is held according to their rank. As a person increases in rank, then they are able to do more things. That is, they can suppress, they can hurt, they can judge others below them in the Hammurabi Code. And if they are convicted, the punishments for those who are high are less severe. In the Biblical Code, there is no difference according to rank. One law is held for all people in all stations in society. There is something else that is similar and yet different between the Hammurabi Code and the Bible, and that is the responsibility clause. Let's take the Hammurabi Code, for instance. If there is a surgeon and he operates on people and those people die, then the surgeon can be held liable and he may forfeit his life. In another case, perhaps even more common, is when a house builder builds a home and that home collapses, then the house builder is held responsible and he may either lose his home to the people who had a home that was collapsed, or he may actually have to forfeit his life. In the Biblical Code, they have something similar. If you have an ox and it goes and it gores someone and hurts them, then for the first time, you are not held responsible, because in the biblical law, it is assumed that you didn't know that the ox was going to do that. But if the ox goes and repeats the problem, gores someone a second time or someone else, and the goring is the second occasion, then you are held responsible and you may actually forfeit your life because you have not corrected the problem with that ox. Now, the fourth of our FLOW concepts of civilization is writing. Let's talk for a moment about that. Writing is actually the lubricant that lets all of the other elements work together. Perhaps less obvious than the others, but equally important. There are really 3 different kinds of writing systems. The first is called logograms. Logograms are pictures that depict either a word or a phrase or a concept. Chinese today is a logogram type writing system. Ancient hieroglyphs, as we will see in a few moments, contain logograms as part of their system as well. And today we have some symbols that mean concepts just in that logogram way. One of those symbols would be a percentage sign. It means something that we all understand. Another one would be a dollar sign, and perhaps another would be a mathematical symbol sign like a plus. Those are signs that mean that have some symbol associated with them. Syllabaries are the second type of writing system, and those systems will have a symbol that represents a syllable, not an entire word or phrase, but more than a letter. So it's somewhat in between. Shorthand is one of those syllabary systems. The text for blind people is often also syllabary in its nature, and the Korean language script is also syllabary. And finally, the system that most of us are most familiar with is the alphabet system. In that writing system, a single symbol represents a sound, a particular sound. Let's be clear about something though. There is a difference between a script and a language. A script is what that symbol looks like. So we might have, for instance, a Roman alphabet, or we might have a Greek alphabet, or the Russians use the Cyrillic alphabet, and of course the Hebrew language is written in the Hebrew alphabet. Those are all different scripts. On the other hand, a language might be something that uses a script. Here are, for instance, 3 different languages that all use the Roman script: the English language, Spanish language, and German language. Even though one language cannot necessarily understand the words in the other language, at least all of the letters are the same because the script is the same. Now, I mention all of that because of one of the key moments of history occurred when Napoleon's troops had invaded Egypt in 1799. And they were spreading out across the Delta region in Egypt, having won a battle and taken possession of that part of Egypt. And some of Napoleon's soldiers found what is called the Rosetta Stone. It was found in the city of Rosetta, and it was a stone that was part of a wall, but it had writing on it, and the soldier was bright enough to recognize it as being something special, and so the soldier called over his commander, and then eventually this stone was passed up to the scientists that were accompanying Napoleon on this Egyptian expedition. So we can see here an artist's depiction of what the Rosetta Stone might have looked like in its original form. The top part would have had some hieroglyphs on it and some other drawings at the top, but that part got broken off. All we have today is the lower portion. And let me just show you a brief video that talks about this stone and what it means. French soldiers realized that there were 3 different scripts on this stone. The top one written in hieroglyphs, the middle one in a script which they didn't recognize, but which we now know is a script called Demotic, and the bottom one in Greek. The top script and Demotic are actually the same language, just written differently. Demotic means language of the people because it's a simpler language than hieroglyphs. The bottom one was Greek. And there's 2 languages then, Greek and the Egyptian languages, and they all tell the same message. And the message is about the king and how he, the Pharaoh, how he helped the people and did good things. Now, what happened is the British beat the French in that war, and therefore they took possession of the Rosetta Stone, and that's why it's here today in the British Museum. But the French wanted to try and interpret the writings, and therefore they put ink on the surface of the stone, made an impression, and they took the impression to France with them. Then there were two men, a British and a Frenchman, who independently, but each one contributed a very important part to interpreting this stone. The Brit worked with the Greek and Demotic, and he worked out the logic of how that language worked. And so he was able to interpret much of the Demotic by analyzing it with the Greek. And then, because the Frenchman knew the sounds of Demotic, that is the modern Coptic Egyptian language, he took the Demotic and was able to incorporate the sound and the writing and certain names and figure out hieroglyphs. And therefore, all of them together were the result of two very creative, problem-solving men, a Frenchman and a Brit, and they worked out the secret of the Rosetta Stone. In summary, the Rosetta Stone is divided into three parts. The upper part is written in ancient Egyptian, which we now call hieroglyph. The middle part was written in Demotic, also an ancient Egyptian language writing, but with a different script. And the lower part was written in Greek, and of course that was a different language and a different script. So there are three scripts, two languages, but only one message. And the message was about the people and how they appreciated the goodness of the Pharaoh or the king as he helped them. Now, I think it's important for us to consider some of the creativity that went into deciphering the Rosetta Stone. There are two men, an Englishman named Thomas Young and a Frenchman, Jean-François Champignon, who were the two people who helped develop and decipher the Rosetta Stone. The Englishman was a true left-brain thinker. He was very analytical, very logical in his thinking. He made many contributions to science. We see the name of Young come up in many different areas, especially in physics and chemistry. A very logical thinker. On the other hand, the Frenchman was a right-brain thinker. He was a humanist, a humorist, both. He loved tricks and puzzles, and he loved languages. Let's take a look at the contributions of Thomas Young first. There are three major contributions. The first is that he was able to translate the Demotic script, and he did that by comparing it with the Greek. And he used logic. Remember, this man is left-brained, very analytical. And so by looking at those two, he was able to give us a translation of both the Greek and the Demotic. He knew the Greek and he could translate the Demotic. The second is a brilliant observation. In this observation, he realized that there were some parts of the hieroglyphic script that were names, and they could be identified because they were in an oval. And by identifying those ovals, those names, and they were almost always royals, he was able to make some important observations. He compared, for instance, one oval with another, and he found similar symbols within those ovals. He theorized that because those were the names of people, those symbols represented letters in their names. Now that's very interesting because he realized that a name cannot be translated. It can only be written down. And therefore the name Cleopatra would be written, the name Ptolemy would be written, and if they're written down, not translated into a concept, then they must be written in letters. And that's exactly what he discovered. The third is that he published a brief alphabet of hieroglyphic symbols based upon this name similarity and the recognition that he was able to develop between the royal names. But that's where he stopped. He couldn't go any further. The Frenchman, on the other hand, was able to complete the task. He independently developed an alphabet for the hieroglyphs. And when he did that, he had more letters than Young had, but he gave no credit to Young. And that may have established some antipathy between these two men. The next thing that the Frenchman did is he was able to use Coptic and figure out the sound of, and use the sound in Coptic and figure out the sound in some of the hieroglyphs. Now, what is Coptic? Coptic is the modern Egyptian language. It is like Demotic, which is a script, but it is the spoken language. It's used only in the Orthodox Christian Church in Egypt today, and when Mass is said in that church, it is said in the language called Coptic. So what the Frenchman realized is that the sound of a D and the sound of a P and the sound of a T, when put together, depet, would be the word for boat. So he was able to realize that certain sounds and certain symbols could be combined together. Then he made a major recognition. The alphabet that he had established, which was based on everything that we've just said, leads to an alphabetic system. It had 30 characters, but when he counted the number of hieroglyphs, there were hundreds, maybe even thousands of characters. He knew that something was missing. It was not an alphabetic script. There had to be more to it. And so he started to investigate, and creatively he discovered that some of the symbols were like Chinese characters in that they had a kind of representation in appearance to what they meant. A good example would be horizon. And here we see that the symbol for horizon looks like the sun coming up over the mountains. And therefore, he identified dozens of symbols that were similar to the meaning of what they were. The next was even more clever. There were some words that were recognized as rebuses. A rebus is symbols that have a sound that when the two sounds are put together, they mean something. In English, let's take this example. Belief can be broken into two sounds, be and leaf. And therefore you draw a little bee and you draw a little leaf, and when you put those two together, it means belief. The word belief has nothing to do with a bee or a leaf. It's only in the sound of the word that they have a connection. And because the Frenchman could speak Coptic, he was able to put these rebuses together. The last contribution was to realize that there were some hieroglyphs that needed determiners in order to distinguish them, because there were some problems that a single hieroglyph might have more than one meaning. For instance, in Egyptian, the word for tax, horse, and twin all have the same letters. So tax, horse, and twin were not distinguishable merely from the hieroglyphic symbol for those three concepts. Therefore, if someone wanted to distinguish tax from horse, they did that because the symbol for tax had added to it another small symbol that looked like a roll of papyrus on which the tax rolls were kept. And horse had an extra little symbol, and that was a little animal, and that meant, hey, I mean horse. And the last one, a twin, had a little person symbol, and that was the definer for twin. Therefore, the Rosetta Stone really just talked about Ptolemy V and how he had granted certain favors to the priests and to the people. The message is not very important, but the deciphering of it, the significance of the Rosetta Stone, is critically important. It's the first time we ever translated an ancient language. The Rosetta Stone was number one. Secondly, it began the concepts of translating ancient records. Up until this time, people had just kind of assumed that it would not be possible. Now, because of the work of these two men, they were able to realize that they could decipher these ancient scripts. And finally, it gave us a key to ancient history in one of the most important of all civilizations. So now you should ask yourself this question: what have you learned about creativity from the deciphering of the Rosetta Stone? That's an interesting point to contemplate. Let me make some suggestions for you. First of all, it needs both right brain and left brain thinking. We see the two men who did the deciphering possessing predominantly one right brain thinking, the other left brain thinking. Secondly, it takes a lot of hard work. Both of them spent years dedicating their life to the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone. Third, it takes an intent. You have to want to do it. It does not just fall out of the sky. And you have to use things from all kinds of experiences and bring them together. And therefore, we see the major features of civilization, the VINE, value, intent, the novelty, and the effort, all go together in the decipherment of the Rosetta Stone. Well, there are other writing systems that we should discuss briefly as well. One of them is cuneiform. This is the language of the Mesopotamian area, which we will discuss in our next lecture. The cuneiform was a script. It was used for many different languages. It was almost always limited to the Mediterranean area, Mesopotamia, in fact. And it had a bunch of little wedgy marks. And those marks give it the name cuneiform, because cuneiform means wedge-like marks. And it has about 1,200 known characters. There are hundreds, perhaps thousands of examples, usually on small stone or clay tablets. And we have lots of them still today. Mostly they deal with business transactions. Here is a beautiful gate at an Assyrian capital, and there next to the gate you can see an inscription written in cuneiform. Here shows the evolution of cuneiform. In the beginning, it began with tokens, money, because it was mostly about business. And here you can see how the very first token would look and how later on those were drawn into a symbol so that they could represent easily what a token looked like. And then finally, those symbols became a little more complex, and they developed some additional meanings. And then because they were so complex, people realized it took too long to write, and therefore they were finally simplified. We see a similar pattern in the Chinese writing system. Here we can see examples of the sun, the moon, mountain, water, and bird, and how they went from a symbol that looked like it to a symbol that was a little more stylized, but became easier for them to interpret. Here we see some ancient Chinese writing on a bone, and it shows 6 different evolutionary steps in that writing, beginning from a fairly simple pictorial representation to today a representation that is more of a script, and that shows the evolution of these languages. Therefore, in summary, we can talk about flow. Civilization began with flow. Food, that's the freedom to join into cities, the ability to live in cities. Labor specialization, working together and using technology. Order and hierarchy, everybody in their place, everybody working together. And writing systems, a way to share information between the people in close proximity. Thank you very much. Be civilized.